Welcome, everybody. I'm Hans Engel, Director of the National Directors Division at the Directors Guild of Canada. So great to have you all here. Thank you so much for joining us for this fabulous masterclass. Before I introduce our very special guests, I'd like to first respectfully acknowledge the traditional Indigenous lands that we all live and gather on today. Although this masterclass is online and takes place at many locations across Turtle Island, we each enjoy the pleasure of living within an Indigenous territory. For those of you watching, as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to use the chat to communicate amongst yourselves. Let us know where you're zooming in from. Say hi to each other. If you have specific questions during the masterclass, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Chase will be looking for those and we'll try to include as many as possible. Julian will be running the tech behind the scenes. We've got some clips to share with you as well. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guests for this masterclass. Shannon Walsh is with us. She is a DGC filmmaker and writer whose award-winning films cover topics ranging from labor rights to grief to climate change. Her films have been theatrically released and broadcast globally, screening in festivals around the world, such as IDFA, Hot Docs, CPH Docs, Docs NYC, as well as playing art spaces such as the incredible Venice Biennale and the equally incredible Pompidou Center in Paris. And if that wasn't enough, she was a Guggenheim Fellow and teaches film at UBC. In 2023, just last year, she was awarded the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. She just released a book called The Documentary Filmmaker's Intuition, Creating Ethical and Impactful Nonfiction Films. And finally, before I run out of breath, her new film, Adrianne the Castle, had its premiere at South by Southwest recently and will have its Canadian premiere at Hot Docs and DOXA coming up very shortly. Welcome, Shannon Walsh.
Thank you so much. This is such a treat.
A pleasure, a pleasure. And to help unpack all that, I'm really, really pleased we have equally brilliant award-winning filmmaker of such works as No Ordinary Man and Framing Agnes, which won the Audience Award at Sundance. He's currently in the edit on his latest film. Please welcome the great Chase Joint.
Thanks, Hans. Hello, Shannon.
Hi, Chase.
So happy to rock out with you this evening. Thank you for joining us. And, congratulations on such a banner year, a banner few years. I really love that Hans had to do the bio lifting work so that I can just do the complimenting. I will disclose to everyone who's in the room with us, metaphorically and otherwise, that we also know each other and talk behind the scenes. And that relationship is very much going to inform the way in which we approach this masterclass, because I'm so grateful for the intimacy of that behind the scenes exchange, because I think it can help to animate some of the questions that I know we both think about a lot as makers, both together and apart. But for those who might not know anything about you, could we start with some broad strokes? Can you tell us a little bit about your early documentary beginnings?
Yeah, thanks, Chase. And just to reiterate, it's just such a pleasure to talk to you because I just admire your work so much as well, and just and your mind and the way you think about doc, and always turn to you when I have questions that I want answered. So it's really fun to be able to be in dialogue. Yeah, my trajectory was a little unusual, I guess. I'm actually in London, Ontario, where I went to an art school here at BL Art, and that's when I first started making films, but I thought that I wasn't collaborative enough. So I thought I couldn't make films and went into photography and literature. But by year two at Concordia, I started wanting to make my photographs move. I kept doing these blurry images. And I was like, I think I actually want to make films. And I started working with people in the film program early on and editing people's works and working with them there. And so I was, film had really been like deep in my veins as a teenager and already starting to make work, but really thinking more fiction and experimental film in those years. And then I think like that, the combination of where I grew up and then really kind of hitting a more political bent in my 20s to start being really involved in social movements and activism. and my own academic work that really made me a lot more interested in the world and what people were facing, and always an interest in people who were vulnerable or otherwise on the margins. That had always been an interest of mine in so many different ways. I think documentary just I kind of fell into documentary because I was already interested in moving image and photography. And then my early films, my very first film, I thought I was going to I started making shorts, like short docs for social movements, just in support of a social movement work, like that was really, I was just like, creating, supplemental material that could kind of get the word out. I was working in participatory ways with young people on social issues. I was doing a lot of kind of social intervention type of work where video played a role. And yeah, my first feature was actually just a short. My friend said, like, they're gonna like use up all the water in Alberta with the tar sands. Like, come out here. Like, anybody we know who has a camera, can you come and like show what's going on here? And then I went out to Alberta, and that was 2006, was really the beginning of starting to make feature films. And I realized I started making that film along with another filmmaker, Alan Cole, at the time. And, we were just sort of a gang of friends and folks that were interested in, politics, but also making films. And Sergio Kirby was the producer on that, and Sarah Spring actually ended up becoming the producer. And yeah, and that I just kind of was like, oh, I think there's a big film here, about the tar sands. And that film, whatever it was, a kind of almost an accidental stumble upon, and then I just kind of went down the rabbit hole, and that started the first film, the first feature film. And I think I really got addicted to documentary and then thinking about it as a form. But I think I was still in the early part of my career thinking a lot about social impact, like making community-based work, thinking about a film as a mobilizing tool, a documentary film. I don't know that I'd really fully like brought together my own art-based interest in film in those early years, because I was really, I was on the streets as well. I was like involved in activism, and I was thinking about my art practice and my documentary practice as maybe less entangled than I do now. Yeah, so it kind of started with that, with H2O. And H2O, I also did a big like cross-country campaign, and really was like really involved with movement building with that film. And it really showed me the way that film could be used as a tool for social activism and really get community together. And, also a film, rather than the film being the driver, the film being sort of like the dinner table, which would bring people around it to be able to deal with issues, but the issues that were important to them in the places that they were. So I really approached the like screening of that film in different contexts, like a place in which, while the film had some content that might be interesting to them or could bring some issues around, that they would have their own elements and aspects to bring to the table, the proverbial table. And that conversation, that the work on the ground by activists was really what was the most important thing in the film, could be a kind of vehicle in which they could get together and push something further. So there was a kind of early sense of a collaborative nature, I think, of like participation, of like getting cameras in people's hands, of using films as a way to connect community, that I think has probably been the thing that's carried through the most. Yeah, since then. It's true.
I love the answer so much. And I'm going to do something that is perhaps slightly unusual, which is to say out loud that the orientation of my questions in this section moved from documentary film as an activist call to the relationship between documentary and social change to collaboration. And I like that in your answer, you've already sort of navigated some of that course. And I'm going to take a second to sort of dive deeper into some of those areas, but I love that your arc is already intuited. Because one of the things that I was really interested in is some of the writing about your early work summarizes your approach as an activist call, as its orienting logic. And I was so curious to know, you use language like social movement building, but what does it mean to be oriented toward an activist documentary practice or an activist aesthetic? Is that a word that you've ever bulked over? How do you imagine activism in your present day thinking?
Yeah, it's really evolved too. So I don't think I could like the person I was 10 years ago probably would have had a different answer to some of that. And I think that the world has changed also, like thinking of 2006, like there wasn't cell phones everywhere. Like we weren't thinking about the way that we document our lives and social movements in the same way at that era. When I was starting out and filming what was happening on the ground. Like you didn't just see movements, what people were doing day to day organizing, like what it looked like in a protest, like stuff like that was still not everywhere. And hearing the voices of people who were walking the streets in protest, like what they had to say wasn't something that the mainstream media was putting out. And that was the era of indie media and, of alternative media, little blossoming, media outlets that were ways that we were, being able to communicate an alternative version of the news. Now it feels like almost quaint, because now it's like there's so much variation that we're lost in the noise in a weird way. But yeah, I think I did would like I think yeah, at that era, I think the idea of just movement building through filmmaking made sense. Like, I don't know that it does today in the same way, and maybe that's like a different conversation. But I really believe in the power of cinema to move people to come together in conversation as much as I ever have. And I think that that to me is always what social change and transformation is about. It is about people coming together, recognizing a common shared reality or struggle, and an empathetic disposition to take action, and empathetic and other like multiple kinds of energies that can converge. And I think film, of course, is only a piece of that puzzle, but it's an important piece. I think it's an important way that we can play a role. And I remember when I made, like, just before H2Oil, I made a film for No One Is Illegal, like the group Solidarity Across Borders. It was named later. And I remember when I moved and I was making some little shorter films for those types of groups. And when I started focusing on H2Oil, it started taking up all my time to make that film. And I remember feeling guilty about it. I remember thinking I should be organizing, not making a film, that this was like navel gazing, that it wasn't valuable. And I had trouble like reconciling, what does it mean to be participating? And I think that feeling now, I think now I really do feel like we are in a garden of types of practice, and that's a really important one. Now I think my worry about using that kind of language is more about like thinking of films as tools or instrumentalizing films, and I think that there's also become an industry of filmmaking that's been like co-opted by the NGO sector and stuff, that is like thinking about films as just we make films, we make documentaries. They kind of like squish down what we do as filmmakers artistically into something that becomes sort of like a like a pamphlet, rather than a process and a practice. And I think that to me there's a tension there. But I think like many kinds of filmmaking can happen, and that's okay too. Like just because it exists, I don't think we have to like denigrate that type of filmmaking either. I think that can also have a real place in what the overall media landscape is.
I mean, so far the phrase from our chat that I'm going to put on a t-shirt is pamphlet, not a process. Um, and it strikes me that something that's emerging in your answer is, I think about early era activist films coming out of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s as one example of a collaborative, cohort-based approach to urgent media making on behalf of minoritized and in solidarity with minoritized communities for immediate circulation, for immediate use and circulation. And because of that immediacy, there was a bump away from the single authorship model, from the auteur, from the person who takes 10 years to make a film because they have the luxury to do so. And yet it's not true that there are no authors of activist cinema. And it's not true that there isn't a kind of auteur aesthetic involved in the genre. And so I'm wondering, in these early days, were you looking to other makers or collaboratives, and who might some of those people have been?
Well, I mean, Mike, like speaking of those early films, like I was really influenced by the early films of ACT UP and the AIDS activist films and filmmakers that emerged in the 80s, that whole period. And as well as like people like Mike Holbloom, who really like, you know, the way that even though those aren't activist films really, but the idea of bringing something that's very personal and like being charged and in discussion with a community that in the early 2000s, like I'm saying before, you know, 5 years, even before I'd made my first feature, those type of films were really on my radar. And I was thinking a lot about like queer activism and the AIDS activism that happened. I curated a series of films actually for a little mini film festival on AIDS activist films in that era. So those were really important. You know, like I've been too minded the whole time. Like I was also like obsessed with like very hardcore art house films, you know, like from like Godard, Wong Kar-wai, like all of this type of thing. And Andrew Arnold's always been a huge influence. So I also thought about like that kind of storytelling. The Iranian New Wave continues to be incredibly important to me in my practice. So I was looking at like the kind of I always liked the idea of experimental films and activist films as films. I can't remember who said it, but films you can put in your pocket, like these little films, these almost like little films that you could toss at someone or put in your pocket or you know use as a slingshot, and also this kind of way of thinking about personal storytelling. Like simultaneously, those two worlds have always collided for me quite a bit.
Oh, I love that answer so much. And, you know, I am aware that we have a trailer from one of your first films. And would you help to set us
Yeah.
up?
So this is like my second feature, and I guess it would be great to, and this kind of does talk a lot about the evolving politics of where I was at. So I was kind of in the earlier moment, and after H2Oil, I was really involved a lot in the anarchist community in Montreal, and also like the big collective processes like at the G8 protests and whatever. And we're just thinking about community and communal living. And I was also living in Quebec and completely fell in love with Quebecois culture. And this film, I thought, can we make a film that would pay homage to early Quebecois verite cinema? And in this case, it was Le 5 Septembre à Saint-Henri, which was this film made in 1962 by Hubert Raquin, who is like a sort of seminal Quebec novelist. And he actually didn't finish the film. There's quite a story, but they collectively took the cameras from the ONF and went out to the neighborhood, working class neighborhood of Saint-Henri and filmed this working class community collectively, all of the kind of big names of verite cinema in Quebec. And there's problems with the film, that early film. It was sort of like these like kind of white guys with suits, like coming into a working class neighborhood and like kind of how their point of view was and all that. And so I wanted to create a situation where we would bring together contemporary Quebecois doc makers, Quebecois, like people living in Quebec, and like Quebecois, Francophone, Anglophone directors, and look at that cinema, think about it, and carve out a part of Saint-Henri in that moment, which was 2010, and spend one day, 24 hours to make a film in that neighborhood and try to look at all the intersecting stories of a contemporary version to pay homage to that moment, but also to behind the scenes really create a collaborative, a kind of collaborative energy. I wanted to bring the joy of what I see as documentary to me as a joyful practice that is about presence and being able to show up. And I wanted all the directors who participated to be able to absolutely love every moment of it, not have to think about financing, not have to think about putting the film together, just show up, film for 24 hours. And they gave us all the footage. We edited the film and to just really be present for this moment of togetherness and collectivity. So yeah, here's the trailer for that.
Thanks in advance to Julian for rolling the clip.
Rythme du matin, édition du 26 août 2010. Ben oui, le mois d'août qui tire déjà à sa fin. À l'extérieur de nos studios, le mercure indique 17 degrés.
Bon, messieurs. Ouais.
Je te l'ai dit, Robert.
travers. On vit nos plus belles années.
On gaspille des millions pour arranger les pylônes, puis dans 5-6 ans, on va les mettre à terre.
Mais Philippe,
Hein?
il filme quoi?
Love story.
Moi, j'adore le quartier, les gens sont gentils, puis on se connaît tous.
C'est là ton école. C'était-tu le fun?
Non.
Des rêves? Oh mon Dieu, je rêve que je vais être millionnaire un jour.
Belle soirée pour le vélo.
Alors c'est le chômage, avec ses longues journées, à traîner ses souliers. On s'en fait pas pour ça, et jamais chapeau bas, car malgré tout on rit à Saint-Henri.
I also love that last frame of the trailer. Whoever edited your Governor General's award winning 3-minute spot lands you on a bench in a very similar frame in that video, a really beautiful intertextual moment. And I think there's no better clip to set up a question about collaboration. So I'm really interested in your introduction to your early self as not being collaborative enough. Where are you now? Can you talk about the collaboration? Perhaps that informs a project like that, but more broadly, collaboration as method.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's just a constant preoccupation of mine is what does collaboration mean? And even maybe my early self, there was a frustration of not knowing how to do it, you know, of wanting it and not being capacitated yet to know what that would look like. But I do give a lot of credit to the political movements I was involved in, and also the education work I've done, like in my kind of side life as an academic and educator, that like taught me a lot about how to work in collaboration. Yeah, I feel like for me with Doc, why I'm so excited by it, but I think filmmaking in general is that we have this like double, I tell my students all the time, we're in a business of relationships, you know, it's relationships on screen and off screen, and sometimes that feels frustrating, but if you look at it in the beauty that it is inherently a job of creating relationships. You know, a lot of times we have this idea that the director is sort of this lone figure spearheading something, but it's never actually that. Like even in the most brilliant director ever that is like a total visionary, it is still a collaboration, maybe a painful one for everyone around that person. But yeah, collaboration and, you know, with the Saint-Henri film, it was really incredible because people felt so good about it, everybody, you know, and it was just fun. And like I interviewed some of the older filmmakers, like on the day I went and Marcel Carrière was sitting in a radio studio, and I ran down and had an interview live on the radio that day. And just this idea of us being together was really important, but then also the care with which that we collaborate with our participants, you know, I think has continued to be really important. It's a complicated question to answer broadly because every film has its own parameters, but I think in general right now, I would say like the way it's evolved for me has really been, how do I bring people through a journey in front of and behind the camera? And that journey and thinking of myself as almost like a rower, you know, like I have a little rowboat and the people are coming on. The rowboat is the process of making the film, and that we are coming on, the film itself, the making of the film itself will take us on a journey. It's a journey that hopefully we can document along the way, that we've got the skills with which to visualize and make that possible. But all of us, the crew and the participants, are going to have a journey together. And so as a director is like, what is the journey that I'm creating? And what is the one that I also am on with them, you know, and trying to be conscious of that and think of it more actively. Feels really important. And, you know, I think politically important to me as well. I think for me that kind of sharing of the space of whose voice is the voice that emerges when we're in relation with people who are actually living like intense experiences, who have a lot to say themselves. Like, where do we pull back and allow in, and do that kind of dancing together to create space, to me is so beautiful. And I just want to get better and better at being able to do that well, so that it comes across on screen.
Well, and it really resonates with an earlier response that you had when summarizing your activist cinema approaches, and how in some ways the film is the byproduct or the after effect, and that the film, yes, while valuable, is actually less significant than the process by which you get there. Funders don't love hearing that, but it's just true. Like, how do you actually sell a kind of process as the thing that is required, as the thing that actually requires the funding? That if you fund collaboration, the outcome is extraordinary, but when you gun toward the outcome without the process, it doesn't always work out that way. And I think that, some of your summary is a very beautiful setup and connection to illusions of control. And I'm going to ask you to play a game with me right now, which is that just a second ago, when you were summarizing Saint Henri, you said it was, can we make a film that? And so if you were to place that question phrase when thinking about illusions of control, can we make a film that?
Yeah. Oof. Oh, illusions of control is my albatross in a way, because so you're really pitting me hard on that, because I think, can we make a film that captures the arrogance with which we find ourselves immobilized, would be like where that came from, and how do the people who are doing something different do it?
I really appreciate it. And I didn't mean to pin you, but also kind of grateful for the opportunity to hear your answer, especially for folks in the room who might not know anything about the film. Now, could you offer us what the summary of the film, because it'll be really interesting to read through that question.
Yeah, and it's a kind of, it's a strange, formally strange film. I go to 5 different contexts, totally different, of people who are living at the front line of some kind of crisis, environmental or personal, that has been brought on through human action in another sphere. So it's kind of like we create our own disaster and then we have to live through it, was sort of the way I was looking around at, like, where have we created disaster and how are we surviving the disasters in which we've created for ourselves. I was thinking a lot about the climate crisis when I started making the film, but also just that it just this barreling towards our own destruction. I couldn't get my head around it. And I wanted to see what people who were already living in those ruins anyway were doing. So I go to Fukushima and met mothers who had created like a citizen-run clinic to find out if their children and the food had radiation, because the government wasn't doing it. I go to China, where people are trying to replant the desert that is taking over their villages by hand, trying to stave off what is the impact of the decreasing levels of water in the Yellow River, a man-made problem, and then a kind of attempted a solution. I spent time with this incredible couple, Sylvia and Oscar, in Mexico, who they had their daughter disappeared through the state apparatus that, well, they don't really know, but they're living in a kind of a state in crisis, brought on by many factors. And they, with a group of parents, searched the desert for bones of their missing children, and are just kind of like trying to, and became citizen forensic experts trying to identify the remains that they find. And I go and talk to the philosopher who I actually originally envisioned being a sort of commentator on the film, Lauren Berlant, who was living through their own crisis at that moment of their body, but had written extensively about what it means to live through crisis, and was sort of having their philosophical ideas brought into play with their own mortality in a really delicate and beautiful way that I also document in that film. So yeah, This is a long summary. Oh, and Yellowknife. I forgot Yellowknife. And Yellowknife, Stacey's where the community in Yellowknife, the Dene community, the Yellowknife Dene have arsenic buried under their community. So much arsenic buried under their community that's a remnant of gold mining, where they extracted all this gold, and the residue from gold mining was arsenic. And there's this gigantic amount of arsenic under their territory that also, as citizens, mothers, family members, are trying to, find a way, navigate a way how to live through something that it will always be underground under them, frozen in place for time immemorial.
It's a really vulnerable and affectively charged film, and we're going to play a clip from it in a moment. But before we get there, sometimes I think about the audience for these kinds of exchanges, and I remember being a filmmaker at different phases in my life, seeking out conversations with folks who I thought were doing really interesting things. And I'm imagining this person in this room somewhere now or in the future, and I'm going to ask a question in service of my totally made up curiosities for this person, which is, can you walk us through a little bit of your early relationship building and approach to making a film such as this? How do you approach subjects, geographies? How do you imagine yourself, you, Shannon Walsh, as the person to whom they should attach in service of these explorations?
It's a really great question. And also, of all my films, probably the hardest one to answer in a strange way, because
I'll ask you again later too, so you can double up.
Yeah, because of different films that made more sense. And I think in Illusions of Control, in a way, I was personally asking the question of what do I have? What can I control out of my own life? And there's a backdrop to every filmmaker's films that we're asking active questions. And in that film, I'm erased from that film in a lot of ways. I erased myself from the film. And I think that is important because of where I was at that time to acknowledge, but also an interesting sort of strange flaw. I'm there all over the place and not there. But how did I approach it? I mean, I research, so I'm a really extensive researcher. I research and research and research. I was living in Hong Kong, so I was in Asia, which was part of what kind of prompted the proximity to China and to Japan as well, because I was in that region. And I was looking in that case, I was really looking for who is surviving in a way that feels different than I'd ever seen. I was really actively wanted to know, I just wanted to know, how do we go on? Can we go on? What does it look like to go on? And I interviewed a ton of people. That film in my mind was going to answer all the problems of the world, and I would have 500 characters. It took me it's the longest film. It took me 7 years to make, partially because it was so much. I wanted to know so much about it. So I was traipsing around and asking questions to people and going with translators. I traveled with translators, or I used local crews everywhere, but and local translators and such. But yeah, that was, how did I imagine myself in it? I think, yeah, it's, I don't know if I can answer that, Chase. I don't know. I feel like it was that was a journey in which I was following my curiosity in such an active way, and in a way I really didn't know the answer to what I was asking. And I do really try to continue to make films in that. I often tell my students, if you know the answer to the question you're asking, you're not asking a good question, because everybody else knows the answer too. And nobody really wants to go on a journey with you if you have not got an active question. And that film is really one in which even today, I think of some of those people in the film and think, wow, just they wowed me, they really wowed me. And yeah.
I really love that. And there's something really generative to me about your answer, insofar as I think we can go out with a set of questions and we can come back in on the other side and not have answers to those questions. And I think it's a beautiful time to bring in the clip from the film, which I think needs no introduction, in my opinion, and we can chat about it on the other side.
Woke up in the middle of the night writing my obituary. I think it's my final gift to the queers. You know how when you die, the obituary goes, she was survived by. But then I thought, she was survived by, and then I'll write, she survived with. And then I get to put all the people I've survived with. That's the thing that really matters to me. It takes a long time to learn things, be changed by things. It also takes a long time to get stuck, you know. Like this is how you know how to do it, so you do it. But everything's just gotten all, you know, reorganized in the last year, and so I don't know why, you know, I haven't figured out who I am in this situation. I haven't figured out how to compartmentalize in this situation because my old defenses have gotten shaken up. My cliche was, who am I if I'm not building something? And I thought, oh, that's such a despairing and grandiose thing to say. So what is that phrase standing in for? And it has to do with the fact that all I do is work, you know, but it's also, I had really wanted a world. And I don't actually feel exactly, I've got a lot of people, but I don't really have a world, you know. And so the question of the relation between living and building has to, the evidence of it has to change for me now. A discourse of survival has so saturated our space of what we can aspire to, when really a discourse of flourishing ought to.
Oof. What an extraordinary clip. You know, as we were talking before the class went live, I was saying I've spent time in that kitchen and in that living room and with those cats and with that human. And I'm so moved by your collaboration with Lauren, in part because it strikes me that you're reckoning and asking similar questions, and that perhaps in that scene there's a kind of mirror to your quest in filmmaking and what Lauren is offering in conversation with you there. And yet those are tracks that are running alongside each other to very different ends. And, you know, I wrote down the quote, "You make worlds at the same time that you're not sure you have one." And what a gorgeous offering for documentary film practice, as well as an imagination of a space where you can do something otherwise and take with you or survive with those who you are collaborating and participating with. And, you know, Lauren, for folks who might not know, is also famous for coining the phrase cruel optimism, which at its most, you know, concise summary is when something you desire is an obstacle to your flourishing. And I also think that while Lauren is not speaking about documentary directly, there's so much to be given to us there. And so you know, coming off of Illusions of Control, and before we settle into the grooves of Adrianne and the Castle, can you take us from the end of this film into the world of your pandemic life, and then we'll arrive at the main course of our conversation, shall we say?
Oof, yeah, yeah. And I think Lauren, I would say, is like a turning point in my career, like being with Lauren and being through that experience. And, you know, Lauren, you know, found out that they were dying and then said, come. And I went to Lauren to talk about cruel optimism, actually. And I didn't know they were living through something. They weren't at the beginning, our first conversation, they weren't. And then they were, and then they called me and said, come, you know, and yeah, so they, and I think that idea of surviving versus flourishing, I would almost say like that there's like a turning point in my own filmmaking that started to think about how am I thinking about the worlds that I'm representing as surviving versus flourishing too, and what does world building look like for me personally. You know, Lauren also really challenged me to say, to like with an openness, but a real pointed openness about, I wasn't sure, as they put it, you aren't sure where to place your object, which was them, in front of you, beside you, or behind you. You don't know where to put them, because I talked about how I wasn't necessarily going to be on screen and my questions might be cut out and stuff. And they were like, Lauren was kind of laughing about that a little bit, but in a generous way, as they always were, kind of saying, you haven't figured out how to be in relation with what you're doing, you know. And I really took that in, you know, like, and I took that in and was like, it's true. I was tentative about where is my relation? How am I showing myself or not showing myself? And while my hand is there, like, what am I holding back? What am I afraid of? And where is the and as Lauren said to me very clearly, which I hope to do something, that's actually, it's not in the film, but I would like to do something with, they said, you know, I wouldn't be talking, I wouldn't be here talking if I wasn't talking to you. I'm talking to you. This is a relational exercise, right? And so, I mean, all of what we've been talking about already, Chase, is like about like this relation, and that is like what the practice of film, we're in relation, but we are there as the filmmakers, right? We are there. And what is that changing? How is that changing? What's happening and all of that? And I suppose that's the question you asked me about illusions of control, which is absolutely true. And it's written all over the threads of the film. And I see now in myself like that my way of my practice is actually a way of being with people. Why I named the book the documentary director's intuition is because I believe that so much of what we do is about like kind of being there. And also documenting, witnessing, being present, allowing the camera to be a presence. So I would say that like Illusions of Control really kind of sunk that in for me. And The Gig Is Up like kind of came in between during the pandemic, just before the pandemic, and also was a kind of it was a project that was brought to me like we're going to make this a film in many different places, and I but you can do it as you want. And I think that, you know, you see in all my film, all the way up till Adrianne, I'm doing multi-voiced films. Every film has like 16 characters, 5 characters, 5, you know, every film was, and it's a chorus. I was really thinking a lot about choral filmmaking. How did like the many voices come together to create a tapestry? And it's hard to edit those. Like I definitely like say like, don't do it if you don't need to. If you're out there going, I want to make a 5-person film, I'm like, try to not do that if you cannot do it. It's really tough to have interweaving narratives. But I did it again with The Gig Is Up, and also like wanted to really capture this whole nature of the gig economy and different work and all that all around the world. But I think like coming down, you know, then the pandemic hit, as you said, I filmed that, I toured that film a lot during the pandemic. And yeah, I think, you know, even with The Gig Is Up and all of these political films, I don't know about you guys, but already you could see in Illusions of Control, there was like a kind of sense of despair and like, how do we actually like live in the ruins of the world? And what does it mean to carry, I think in Illusions of Control, already this sense of grief was like this kind of reckoning with grief and our emotive and affective collective life was coming through for me a lot, like wanting to see what that looked like. And I think that really brought me to Adrianne the Castle, and like why that really resonated for me. I felt like, you know, we think it like, I think if we look back all the way to like, what is this table that I'm setting through the documentary that you can come and sit at? Like, what is the function of my film in terms of building something, building worlds, as Lauren would say, and creating environments with which we can flourish. And I really felt we needed love. I needed love. I needed to like cry. I needed to feel like the emotional connection of togetherness. I needed to really sit in the emotional, affective world. And Alan opened his doors of his love castle. And I said, this is it. Okay, this is where I gotta be. It's the love castle. So yeah, maybe we can play. Well, no, we're not quite at that place for the clip of that, but yeah, that film follows this, you know, Alan St. George and his wonderful wife, Adrianne St. George, who built this like castle to their love in rural Illinois. Every room kind of hand created and done with all sorts of affection of their creativity. And then she passed, and he was left kind of as this like kind of monk in the temple of this world that they made together. And then, so our film kind of tells the story of their love story, kind of takes Alan collaboratively through the journey of his grief, through retelling their kind of their love story. And yeah, and you know, it was about telling their story, but it was really deeply collaborative, the most deeply collaborative process I've ever done. Also having a participant really game. He's a mascot maker and a creator, and an incredible artist in his own right. And in that way, he was, and his heart on his sleeve, and he was ready to say, let's have an adventure, let's have an emotional adventure, and like create a world together. And you know, I think that's, yeah, like, and can we flourish and create a space? And yeah, so that film was so fun.
I love it. And thank you for so beautifully taking a kind of unwieldy question and just landing the plane. I really appreciate it. And David, I want to acknowledge that I see your question in the Q&A, and I'm going to weave it in at a moment that makes sense to do so. And I'm holding it in my mind. I love Adrianne the Castle. Congratulations on such a fun and beautiful and extraordinary work. And I have a collection of questions that are going to get a little bit nitpicky in service of practice and form and method. But before I get into those specifics, I want to say back to you something you said to me earlier today, which is, I'm always making love letters.
Yes.
I'm always making love letters. And I really love that as a frame of thinking across all of the films that you have already articulated, and really the way it crystallizes most explicitly in this piece. One of the things that happens, as I'm assuming a lot of folks in this room have not seen it yet, I'm going to do a little bit of exposition to set up my questions so that folks can follow along regardless. We see a moment really early on in the film where you walk into what appears to be a sound booth, and you are in conversation with Alan about the reading of a voiceover script. It's a little nod to a Sarah Polley's Stories We Tell. It's a setting up of a kind of protagonist journey. Talk to me about the role, talk to us, it's not a me situation, talk to us about the role of a narrator and of scripting in a project like this.
Yeah, I mean, often the question you ask when you're starting a documentary is like, what's happening? You know, because it's very hard to tell a story that's already happened. I mean, you can, but you know what it takes to do. So what's happening in the present? So this film, you know, I realized early on that while their story was interesting, it had all happened already, more or less. So how were we going to write? Like, I'm a big believer in writing for doc, and part of my book, like I spent a bit of time talking about it, and I really believe in the writer in documentary. Yeah, and I think in this case, you know, so this film was very much written and thinking a lot about text, using text that Alan and Adrianne had written themselves, and integrating their own writing as a way to use narration to tell bits and pieces of their story. But I think it was also, for me, a way of like, there in this film, there's many techniques that I used as a way of dislodging a kind of interview technique, to dislodge a revisitation of the past, to think about how to take someone through a journey in a slightly kind of roundabout way. And I think narration, in this case, reading your own words, and you'll see in the film, it did work in that way a lot for Alan. There was moments where it was through the narration that we were able to also, I would be able to pay close attention to him and follow where he went, or where he went in his mind or in his memory, to use those moments also. But of course, in a practical way, it's a great structuring device. A narration can be really helpful in structuring parts of the story. Sometimes we think of narration as a crutch, like we use narration when we don't know what else to do. But in this case, it was really, you know, about bringing like Adrianne's voice as well as Alan's voice, since she wasn't there to tell her own story, but she had written with him quite a lot of these pieces, to bring her voice in through his voice. And yeah, so there's a kind of lots of dimensions of using the narration.
Well, and it strikes me that it's related to the quest to make a love story. And if we think about the genre of love stories and rom-coms and romances and storybooks, it's a very fitting device to allow us to feel welcome on the journey.
Yeah, at the very beginning, the idea was a fairy tale. Actually, we had like kind of thought about script. Some of the way they wrote was, so we were thinking a storybook fairy tale as the structuring device for the film. But yeah, your question about the love stories. Yeah, absolutely. This is like a true, like on its face love story, but every film has been a love story of one kind or another, to a place or an idea, or, you know, in this case, like a true love story. I mean, do we ever make anything that there isn't some kind of obsession or love or something too? Like, how could we endure the years it takes to make films if we're not kind of in love somehow with what we're trying to do, right?
Totally agree. Or who we're trying to do them with, right? I mean,
Exactly.
there's a
Absolutely.
there's a really beautiful scene where Alan is dressed as a bus driver and is driving a younger Alan as we're learning the story of Alan's encounter with Adrianne that causes his heart to explode in many directions at once toward her. And he says something very beautiful, which is, this is a chance for me. I can drive the bus. I can drive the bus. And if we want to really take that for all it's worth in this film, it's also a way of him. You are allowing Alan to drive many buses, if we want to keep going with this language in the film. You know, how did that collaborative process work?
Yeah, it was very, and the bus scene is like the epitome of that too, where there was just a lot of moments. We have a little bit that we will, you know, that's in the film. But it was a constant back and forth with between, well, Laurel, who co-wrote the film with me, and was like, it's actually like, I found the story because of Laurel, and she's also my best friend. There's a lot of love behind the scenes. And she and I would talk to Alan for hours and hours on Zoom calls before we started. And then in the filmmaking process, we would also constantly be bouncing ideas off of him, saying, here's an idea for this. And he'd say, no, but what about this? And no, you know, and so almost everything that came originally from like researching deeply everything they'd written, everything that he told us, and then kind of working with him to turn some of those ideas into scenes and worlds, to give him this like experience. Really felt like, but every step of it would be, there wasn't a thing we did that I didn't say, Alan, here's the idea. What do you think? What would you do? Would you do that? You can't do that with every subject, but this case, that was absolutely part of it. Was the process. It was like as deeply entwined with everything. You know, that is the film, is this part of this back and forth of creating the world with him, because their relationship was about creating a world. They created a world that they inhabited on their own, and it just seemed fitting. There was no way we could do it without allowing Alan, like as much as possible, to have agency over creating that fantasy world for the screen.
Let's see some of that relationship building in action.
All right, so yeah, just thinking about what dresses maybe we could use for the casting.
So I'm thinking like this should be in the running, this caftan, which flows and it's got that sparkle.
Yes.
And it seems kind of magical and otherworldly, you know. So I feel like that's a
I love
good
that.
choice.
That's beautiful. Yeah,
Okay, give me
that's
that one.
amazing. And did she make all of these, or how was like
Designed
yeah.
them and had them made, so the seamstresses did it. I'm thinking there's a couple hundred in storage.
They're all color coordinated,
Yes,
and like,
they are.
is this
These are
how
all
she
dates,
did
like,
it, or?
Yeah, and she had a book that would do the color and daytime, evening. This is one of the very early ones, but she was doing Victorian.
Oh wow, that
And
is
that-
incredible.
I feel like the Victorian style works really well.
Yeah, one of the reasons we were thinking about using the costumes is trying to figure out how do we represent Adrianne in this film.
Right. Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough one. I think it has to be artistic and aesthetic and suggestive and stylized rather than flat out, this is going to be Adrianne now, because we just can't. I don't think we can do it, right? I mean, that's my feeling. I just don't think it's possible. So
You mean to get an actor to do it?
to get an actor to be an impersonation of Adrianne, because she was so one of a kind, I think it's better to suggest something rather than fail trying to just say, this is it, this is her, this is it, you know.
Yeah.
Adrianne was kind of ahead of her time in a way. I think she'd fit in so well today with Instagram and TikTok and stuff, because she said, more than once, she said, Alan, you have your art that you do, but I am my art, which was true. And so designing herself, you know, her hair and her clothes and you know, the way she walked and talked, she was so unique that she really was her own art.
Yeah.
Well, I feel utterly transported every time I see any portion of this film. The chat is blowing up. You don't even need to click on it. I can just tell you that people are really thrilled. And there's so much to unpack here. I mean, one of the things that I love so much about Alan's offering around any representation of Adrianne needing to be stylized, needing to be suggestive, is the clarity with which he's able to say, striving for a kind of verisimilitude or a reality is a failure.
Absolutely.
And it's such a middle finger to documentary. It's such a middle finger to the process by which we come to represent people as true or real or authentic. And can you spend a few moments elaborating your approach to casting and costuming as a result?
Oh yeah. I mean, you know, as Alan says, and he says Adrianne always would say reality is for those who lack imagination, which has been our kind of tagline for the film, and also is also a big middle finger to documentary in a way. Also, only if you think that documentary is about reality. You know, I think for those of us who practice this art, know that what it, you know, and what I teach my students too, is that in fact, it's the genre that actually asks the question of truth. It is the one genre that does that. You know, with fiction, we all suspend our disbelief and truly desire this to be true. But documentary is always problematizing the truth, and that is like and asking us to look and who's looking and who's the watching and all that. So, anyways, like that for the costuming for doing this process with Alan, you know. I like every dress we picked with him, like we thought about her different periods and her look. I mean, we also had, you know, a great crew and everything. Like, so everyone participated in that. Nalo Salini Bruce was our production designer, and she had the idea of those great. I mean, Alan and I first talked about the masks, and then she came up with the kind of white face covers and made those wonderful placards. But it would just be such a joy because we would be back and forth with Alan saying, okay, well, what about this dress? And like, what if we cover their faces with white? And he would be like, oh my gosh, yes, that's going to be amazing. It's like the mannequins come to life, because those mannequins that you see are actually all over the house. So, and he has a whole thing about the mannequins because Adrianne was a larger sized woman, and he's like always up in arms about that you can't get a proper mannequin. Like, he's like, it's ridiculous, you know, they had to put padding. He's like, this, you know, I need to find properly sized mannequins because her dresses look beautiful the way that they should be shown. And so they had to put padding on the mannequins and everything. So we've got these kind of blank faced Adrians all over the house. So we thought, okay, let's make the mannequins come to life and in the after hours. And that it was very emblematic of the process with him throughout. With each of the ideas, it had a lot of that kind of like, let's pick this, let's do this, you know, just incredible fun. And I think what he offered in terms of the, you know, the impossibility of representation about Adrianne, even her own self-representation, she had like 7 personalities, and, you know, she would have different, and don't we all, you know, like she went further than most of us do, but she also like lived in that I'm not fixed kind of world, you know, like that was like her. And he really like was like, you know, he said, I bought special gifts at Christmas for her blue personality because those were gifts for blue. And you know, he just went with that. And I really feel like there's something liberating in not trying to unpeel the onion, you know, it's that unpeel the onion, and when you get to the center of it, there's nothing there. It's like, maybe don't unpeel the onion, maybe like you know, like maybe let the like all of the things, you know, just grow in their different worlds. We don't need to like kind of drill down into some kind of like perfect accuracy, because it doesn't exist anyway.
Yeah, I love that. When I heard the reality is for those who lack imagination, I was immediately thinking of Grierson's definition of documentary as the creative treatment of actuality and the synergies between these worlds. You know, I am also someone who makes hybrid work, who is really thinking at the boundaries of documentary as a genre. And I often am confronted with the question in Q&As around performance and embodiment and how you approach directorially the potential of such techniques. Can you tell us a little bit about how you approached performance and embodiment in this film?
Like, but say more to how you mean. Like,
Yeah, so we see a variety of different ways of being in the film, one of which is quite literally on a stage where a play is unfolding. So that's one way in which we could interpret performance, and I would love to hear those answers. But then there's also these much more ambient exchanges where you understand that Alan is also performing for you as our romance lover protagonist. And I would love to know the differences in your directorial approach to those styles of shooting.
I mean, I've started to talk about what I was doing there. You know, I have a background, also a kind of side life as, you know, in academia, in which I've done participatory work with people before on social issues, like as a research practice and as a interview elicitation device. And I would say, like, in this case, I started talking about some of these performative elements as like memory prompts, rather than thinking about them as reenactments, but as actually a kind of method of interviewing, actually. So I'm kind of thinking, and interviewing is the wrong word, but for journeying, let's say, with someone into a different space. So I think, you know, I mean, it was quite striking because, for example, there's a moment in the film where Alan, he's wearing his czar outfit and he's walking around the house, and he told me that after Adrianne died, he would play this music over and over again and just walk through the house and walk through the house, and it comforted him to hear that music. And I said, okay, can we film that? Let's walk through the house and the czar out and put on the outfit, and like we're in this moment and here inhabit this moment again. And I actually, even myself, didn't realize that, like, he went there, he went right there, and we walked through the house, and he stopped, and Adrianne came to him in the room, and he wept. And that was performative because it was created for the camera, but it was not performative because it allowed him to enter a kind of recess of his memory with us, close, and I hope, in comfort and safety. And then, like, so there was that kind of thing. And then the performances of their story was also, you know, we brought Alan into, you know, there was something that struck me early on that I felt very called to be to serve Alan in this journey. So it was, and it's hard to quite describe that, but even the performances where we brought in actors to do things felt to me like a way for, there's something about grief sometimes that feels like an itch you can't scratch enough. And people don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to let you have the space to feel the bigness of your feelings. And there was something with Alan that it was like he was bottled up with the grief, and to let the story explode onto stage and have that kind of embodied representation, would allow, I thought for him to have an experience, and also for us to kind of go places with him that would be very unique. Yeah, there were so many moments of this kind of embodying performativity that to me they were, and it was like, can we try this? Can we try that? What will happen with the, each of the different ways of embodying, of whether putting on a mascot costume or re-inhabiting a memory or having actors recreate right beside you a moment of your own life. To me, they all felt like we were world building the world of his interiority into an exterior space, for him to kind of wander around in and play in, and for us too to like understand better where he was and what happened with them and what their life was. Yeah, if that answers.
So much in that answer that's so interesting to me. In particular, when you think about the interiority of his house and how it became a kind of cocoon or shell, which then this film exposes differently. We had a little bit of a taste for it in the clip, but it's extraordinary. I don't know if I've ever seen a kind of material unfolding of a love story in that way. And so the materiality of the world is so critical to the affective universe that you're creating. And it seems like the process of making is also an opportunity to show Alan something about himself that he might not be able to see. And I'm curious, as it relates to collaboration and participatory action, what has been the relationship with Alan as you have now assembled his crying into a cut? And I say that specifically because it's all well and good to experiment, but what happens when it's starting to be placed into a sequence?
Yeah. And it's been a really amazing, a really interesting process. And because people are interested in process, like as creators that are on the call, like, people have really different feelings about like when to show people cuts and how that participatory. And I think even Chase, you and I have different approaches. And actually, I would say every one of my films has a slightly different one. But my general feeling, if someone's on screen a lot, is that I really do feel that I'm building a trust relationship with them ongoing from zero, like day zero, all the way through. And I hope when I'm in the editing room, I've built enough trust that I myself should have a barometer to what like is going to work or not. And I don't tend to show people cuts unless I feel that there's something that they might be concerned about. So that's generally been my approach. And I'm in my ideal world, I like to show people a cut with people in the room, with an audience. I feel like it really is hard to look at yourself in your own life without having some sense of how people are receiving it. So that's how I work. A lot of people have different approaches, and I think all of them are valid and good and have different reasons. But for this, I also, once we were in the edit, we finished the cut before showing Alan. But Laurel and I drove down to Havencrest, to the castle, and we set up a private screening in the castle. And I knew it was such an emotional film that we would need to show Alan privately. So yeah, we had like a little private screening with him, and he wept and we wept and he cried and laughed and it was, he said, he was concerned about the crying, actually, like about his crying. And sometimes he tries to fast forward through that part. But he just said, he's like, it's a work of art. And, he was like, just so, he's been thrilled with the film. Apparently, like he kept watching, we left him with the copy and he just kept watching it over and over and over, fell asleep watching it, watched it like many, many times. So he's watched the film, like, and when we showed it at South by Southwest, he and I sat through every screening, the whole film. And we still cry in the film. And And he said in the feedback, like the Q&As so far, he said he's felt it's really been healing, and really given him a perspective on his grief that he didn't have before. Yeah, so he's been really, really grateful actually about having the process of the film, and I think it does continue. Yeah, it's a mix of hard, but I think it did the thing that it was meant to do, which is kind of bring him through a process in which he sees he's both celebrated and she's celebrated, and also that there's been some kind of a healing process there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, your answer of a few answers ago beautifully led us into Adrianne and the Castle. And so I didn't say this about illusions of control then, but I'm going to say it now, which is the opportunity to have an object where someone like me, who is emotionally attached to Lauren, has a chance to be in conversation again in that space or see those rooms again, is such a generative and important part of that process that you make available through your work. And I can imagine, and I'm hearing the synergies in what's made possible to Alan in similar ways. So when we think about, yes, it's the process, less the product, it's the process, the product also matters. And we're arriving here to like what is at stake in the kinds of objects that we create and the kinds of traces that we afford others to find along the way. We have a process-based question from David in the chat that I'd love to bring in. It's about the sequence with the mannequins and the lovely music. Did you shoot it with playback? Did you have the music for shooting? Was it temp music, no music at all, a choreographer? I think you should answer all those questions. And it ends with a compliment. Final result was exquisite.
Thank you. Yeah. So we had Richard Reed Perry, who did the music for the film, actually came on set with us for a lot of the shooting, and who composed. And if you see the film, there's a lot of musical, like live musical pieces as well, with people singing and stuff. And so he was really great to have around. But in that particular moment, and Laurel, who was the co-writer, is a musician and everything. And it was that particular sequence with the we actually had choreographed it as just this S walk through the room. And when we got everybody together, it was like, I don't know what happened. Sometimes I feel like these are Adrianne moments, but where I was like, it has to be a waltz. We just felt it has to be a waltz. And so we actually, Laurel is a musician, so she was able to like clap out a waltz. We didn't actually have the music at all. We clapped out a waltz with a clicker, with a click track. And it was actors. Those were all actresses that had tried out to play Adrianne. And they like, I mean, they were weeping in the callbacks, like loving meeting her, and just like, we just so emotional about just knowing about Adrianne. And so we said, do you guys want to all come to Havencrest and participate? And so as documentary subjects, like not really actors. And so, yeah. And so they are the Adrians, and yeah, and we clicked it out, and then choreographed it a few times with them and the camera, and went for it. And then Richard made that music after the fact, but to a waltz beat like that we established there. It just felt right. But generally we were a little bit more composed, and then that was the only one that was really like boom, we're gonna choreograph this like right now on set, right here. Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah, it was
As
really
we move into the fourth quarter of our chat, I'd love to expand back out toward questions that I'm going to call a lightning round about the state of the field. But it's also a really nice way to tie in David's second question, which I think is a really exciting, actually, moment to consider your answer, which is in these polarized times, I wonder how you think about the echo chamber phenomenon in terms of audience. And if you intentionally try to build bridges to wider audiences that include people with different ideologies who are not inherently receptive of the story, excuse me, how do you overcome the limitation of preaching to the choir? Is that part of your process? And David, thanks so much for these questions. And I encourage other folks to join if you're interested. And Shannon, maybe I could ask you to answer that question in many multifaceted ways, because I think it's project specific, but it's also an orientation to the political present.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on that. And I think it's always the question of like, how do we get our films to wider audiences, and what kind of, there's, some people, and there's just so many opinions about this, right? Like there's some people who feel like the very ways that we get our stories to wider audiences shouldn't be taken because it denigrates our practice. Like, for example, using 3-act story structure, and like that is actually like people feel, like I always think about, will my mom like this film? My mom is like not a sophisticated viewer. She likes films and movies and stuff, but she's not necessarily going to an art house film or even a big documentary watcher. Yeah, like I personally, I think the answer to the finding a broader audience, if that's what you want, is, and getting out of an echo chamber, is making stories that like touch people. Just feel like that's for me, like if it can ring a bell, that feels like, yeah, I think that's one part of it. But the echo chamber of like speaking to the choir, I think is always the problem with all activist work and anything that is a little bit more niche, is that we sometimes do find ourselves, like thinking that we're getting a broad audience and actually always sort of in our little, but is it so bad either? Like there's some parts of it, it really depends what you're doing, like I think there's a really valid place for like art films that are experimental, that are like made for like even galleries and don't have huge viewership. And there's also a place for like big, bold, like HBO type films that are going to get like lots of eyeballs. I suppose it depends what you want to do. But for me personally, I'm definitely interested more and more in trying to reach broader audiences and more diverse audiences and trying to bring people in. I think like, I think but I think it's also like, are you good enough? Like, are you good enough? Like, that's the thing to me where it's like, you can say, oh, I wasn't meaning to do that, but it might just be that the film isn't good enough, no, like I'm saying that about my own films too. Like, sometimes you do want a big audience, but you don't get one because like it doesn't resonate enough. And what is the magic sauce to make a thing resonate if that's what you want it to do? If we knew that, then everybody would be like, able to do it. And of course it is in art. Preaching to the choir. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think about my audience a lot. I guess that's another way to answer it. And I have a section of a chapter in the book as well about, and it's become more a part of my process in the past few years to think about, who am I making this film for? And why? Like that I ask that question in the writing, not in in distribution. I learned that through some of the impact producing environments that I've been part of, and I hadn't really considered it deeply, I must admit, earlier. Even if I was really trying to make an activist film, I hadn't really thought about my audience deeply as I was making it. I hadn't been specific about my audience. I'd been wide. Everything should be for everybody. And that's just not a good answer if you're trying to do something that's going to really touch people. I think being more specific is always better, as much as you can be, and really trying to find, sometimes I'm wrong about who I think my audience is. Like I'm not, even with this film, I kind of thought we were going to have a certain audience, and I'm not sure I'm right, but we'll see. Like ask me in a year who was the audience. But yeah, I think doing that work to think more deeply about who your audiences can really help you get outside of, if you're just going to be like, I made a film, throw it out, like it's out, then you're going to be preaching to the choir all the time, because then you're just at the same old venues, same old film festivals, same old people who show up to community-based screenings. But if you think, you know what, like I really want to show, like this film, for example, one of my goals for it, I really would like to connect with people who are in bereavement or in grief processes. I want to use the film to talk to people who are dealing like in the space of grief differently, and think about those audiences as a place. So I've like talked to some people who work in geriatrics areas at universities, and who are working in spaces like that are dealing, just thinking about a different way that could provoke a conversation, like create a dinner table, but this time around grief. I also would love, so that's a roundabout way to say it, but I think that's one of the things for me. And I'd really try to encourage my students to think like, a bit outside the box about who would love to see this film, who's your super fan, which is like, who is the person who most needs to see this film. And if you don't know who that is, then that's kind of a problem because probably nobody's gonna really like it if you can't get really specific about, I know for sure this specific, it can be a hard exercise, but I think it's a worthwhile one and can help tighten the edit in the writing and the editing process.
I think is a really generous answer. Thank you for expanding on so many different component parts of that question. And David's responding in kind in the chat. And I think it's a question that often gets asked of makers, especially in a moment of extraordinary or visible success around pitching projects. And I think one of the things that's so interesting is when you dial back in, you realize that those questions are ever evolving and are project specific, and there is really no one answer, and that audiences are a kind of amorphous blur that also don't have a contained shape that you can't rely on all the time. And so there's so many different pieces that I really appreciate the opportunity to think out loud about.
Yeah. How would you answer that? Because like, do you feel like I'm curious because you've hit some, like you have some, like more than I do, probably a kind of audience that you've really been like working on building stories with. And I wonder, does that feel, I'm curious how you'd answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question that I also wrestle with. In some ways, my last film, Framing Agnes, was a hyper-specific story about a moment in a very particular community history in a very particular cultural context, and it had some of the widest circulation on account of its, I think, formal moves and other kinds, and the power of its on-screen collaborators and the kinds of ways in which it stitched into an ongoing conversation in the socio-political moment. But I made that film and no one would want to fund it. So Telefilm, thank you for the money. But also lots of other people didn't want to. And there wasn't an imagined audience for it because of the ways in which minoritized publics are treated as outside of the mainstream. And so it's a much longer answer, and I won't take up your masterclass time telling you more. But just to say that it's definitely something that I continue to think about, as I too believe that there are broader strokes that we can make to make a kind of socially engaged cultural impact, and where do those questions need to be asked, of whom, when, and why, and those answers for me are ever changing.
Yeah, and I love that, Jason. I think it's interesting because you kind of went so specific with Framing Agnes, and then it did so well. And I think that sometimes like the myth is that you have to appeal to like a broad audience, and sometimes actually being specific is the best thing you can do. Like being really like dedicated and authentic towards the subject that you're trying to tell, I think can also allow it to appeal to a broader audience.
Yeah, and I think that for me, the easiest answer, or the most consistent answer for me, is those who are most impacted by the stories we are telling and exploring. That is audience A. Everything else is a concentric circle, and everything else you can pivot and make all kinds of choices. But the vulnerability of that central core is the enduring commitment.
Absolutely. I think we totally agree on that. And I don't think everybody does, interestingly. But yeah, like to me, the first and most important audience is the film participants. And if they like hated the film or were upset with it, to me, that would be like, I don't know that I could go on with it, honestly. Like to me, it is everything. Yeah.
So we're going to end our chat by talking a little bit about your book, The Documentary Filmmaker's Intuition. Congratulations on its publication. And there's so many different directions we can go. But as we're winding down here, I wanted to take seriously the sort of key terms of your title, which is creating ethical and impactful documentary films. And perhaps as one of our ways out, how can you help us to think about what ethics and impact mean in documentary as a field?
Well, I hope like through like how we've been talking so far that people will gather that that ethics itself is also a process. I think, that's one of the things I try to transmit. There's not while we can have guidelines and handbooks and forms and those kinds of important things, like every situation is going to call for a different kind of ethical engagement. And I think it needs a really, one needs an active an active disposition towards dealing with ethics. But I think first and foremost, really, there's some in the book, I've like outlined, there's a lot more out there now of like tools that we can use that can guide us and help us to figure out how to do that, because it can feel really daunting, I think, to think, how do I approach this? There's a lot of questions to think through, like, am I the right person to be going into this community? Like, am I the person to tell the story? Like, how do you even answer that question? I think people are very daunted by even asking the question. And I think, no, ask the question and think really about the answers, because that answer is also not simple. It doesn't mean I can only make a film about London, Ontario, because I'm from London, Ontario. It also can be like a deeper asked question. And I think if we commit ourselves to being accountable to communities, to our participants, to the film community, and to our own ethical guidelines, this can go a long way. Documentary's really been like in the Wild West for a long time with really poor ethical practices, I think, just in terms of like kind of extractive practices and parachuting in and kind of taking stories out and not having any real relationship to the communities or the people in which they've been part of. And I really hope that, you know, we are more accountable to our process as part of, you know, that we ask the questions of how did you make this film is a part of the, like, what makes a film good is like, how was it made? It's just because it's like the object is good. If the process was terrible, like that should matter. And I think like we should hold ourselves and each other to like, you know, thinking through that and being serious and accountable to that. And I think with impact, it's also, you know, I think what's interesting is like, and I kind of problematize a bit in the book, the way in which documentary has been turned into a kind of tool. You know, actually talked to many people, including you, Chase, about like how people feel about that word, because in a way it's like become like a bludgeon to what we think we're doing and what we're trying to do, and how a kind of NGO culture has kind of come in and used a type of language that we haven't used previously to kind of transform what we do into something that maybe looks a little unrecognizable at times. But I think that said, that I think there is a beautiful way in which you can think about, you know, having a life for your film that's not only about a film festival. You know, it's not that films, like I keep coming back to, can set the table, can bring people together, can do something really extraordinary that really, I think, feels to me as part of this process-based filmmaking, in which impact itself is also, we are evolving. Like when the object is created as an object, we can have a further impact. And as we make it, how can we think about impact in the process of making, and how we enter and participate and create worlds with people and create, like, take them on a journey into their memories or into their lived experience? How can that also be transformative for them, and how can that integrate into how we think about impact and what that can be? So you know, I talk kind of a bit about the history and also the practical side of what you can do to just think through your films more thoughtfully. I think, you know, sometimes there's still a misconception that gets thrown around that we don't write docs, that we don't really think about how we make them, that we kind of grab a camera and we found some crazy person or some interesting person, and boom, there we go, and that the editor is the one who makes the film. And, you know, I hope the book dispels that. And the main title talks about intuition, because I think, you know, to me, what we are is in a process of intuitive relationality and collaboration with people when we make nonfiction. We are in the world, we're disrupting, disturbing, creating, collaborating. We are doing a lot in relation when we bring a camera into a space, whatever space that is, whether it's a living room or it's a far-flung place. And that is wonderful, beautiful, magical, totally addictive for me. And also like something that I think like that's part of what you need to continue to build. Like where is my voice in that, and how can I show up and be present so that I can really create that experience for others, you know? So yeah, those are some of the things that I was excited to kind of share some of how I teach. It's a first round, and I got to talk to like a lot of other great folks, and I hope to do a second edition. So buy your copies now so I can go to second edition and do more interviews because everyone is so different. And I think there's been this idea that documentary is one thing. And to me, it's the most open, dynamic, formally diverse, and exciting of the moving picture areas. So, kind of, I always say to my students, if you can dream it, you can make a nonfiction film about it. Like, that's the craziness, is like that it is actually more expansive as a form than fiction, that really does struggle to discard a 3-act narrative. Like, we don't have that limitation. We can go all kinds of places, all kinds of crazy places, and literally anything goes. You can kind of try anything, and somehow often it holds. And that's, it's a really exciting art form. And I see people like you, Chase, and others like really continuing to push the form and think about what we can do with a film, how a film can be like an actual like experience, for people both before and after it's made. And yeah, so that's some of the stuff that I really hope to kind of spark with the book and keep people thinking about how to, use like films as part of an ethical process and practice. There's the pitch.
What a beautiful way to usher us out. So I know that you were on the eve of going to Hot Docs with Adrianne.
Yes.
What else can you tell us about where you're going, what you're doing, what you're excited about?
Yeah, and definitely, like I will say, I saw some people asking where to see films, and my website, actually, shannonwalsh.ca or com, has one, I always get it mixed up, does have like where the links to the trailer. There is some pay-per-view through there, and NFB has St. Henry streaming as well. And yeah, Adrianne is going to play a 60-minute version of it. Will play on CBC Passionate Eye in the fall, but it's starting its Canadian tour. So please come to theaters to support the film. We're going to be at Hot Docs on the 26th and 27th of this month. I'm going to Bafiki in Buenos Aires next week to show the film in Argentina. And we're opening the DOXA Film Festival in Vancouver with Adrianne the Castle, which should be really wonderful. I'm really looking forward to that. So hopefully some of you on the call, please come and say hello if you were here and we didn't get to see your faces. Yeah, and I'm so fired up from Adrianne the Castle that I'm already shooting a new film, because like you said, it's just the process is kind of everything to me. And I know I should just follow the film, but I want to make more films. Yeah, so here we go.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Really such a pleasure to be in conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chase. It's so great to talk to you always.
I think that was the epitome of the word masterclass. Thank you so much. I mean, that was so enlightening, so invigorating. Really, really appreciate it, Shannon and Chase. Absolutely fantastic. And yes, please come and see the film Adrianne the Castle at Hot Docs and DOXA, coming very, very soon. And buy the book. Also, where can we get the book, Shannon?
Oh, the book you can get on Amazon, but you can also get on Routledge.com. I think it's a little bit cheaper on Routledge in general. Yeah, there's and kind of anywhere you can buy books, but just search my name and Documentary Filmmakers Intuition.
Fantastic.
Or it's on my website too. I think I have a link on there.
Okay. Well, absolutely amazing. And this conversation will also be turned into a podcast. And it will also be the video of this will also be on directors.ca as a masterclass in the masterclass tab. So tell your friends, watch this, because this has certainly been a very important and really, really fascinating conversation. So thanks again to both of you, and all the best on both of your films as you're making them, as they're rolling out, as they're being released, and hope to see you really, really soon. Thanks so much.
Amazing. Thank you.